It's my pleasure to introduce the speaker of this session. They are Anne Gladlon and Adrian Hoverwood from the University of Manchester. And the title of their talk is Agile Methods for RSE, a formula for scrum-driven software development. Over to you.
Okay, is my microphone working okay? Yeah, great. Okay, so this isn't our first slide, but we've put it up first because we do have some questions to ask you for feedback. So we thought we'd put this one up first just so that you can have a look at the URL and the access code. So I'll go back to the first slide now. So that will be coming up again later. Okay, so I'm Anne Gledson. I'm a research software engineer at the University of Manchester, and this is Adrian, who's head of research software engineering, who's going to be presenting the second half of this. So the research software engineering department, we're growing quite rapidly at the moment. So we've got about 55 RSEs now. A lot of them are fairly new, and about 70 projects, even more in the pipeline that we've got to assign RSEs to. So we've got a lot of projects. We've got a lot of customer relationships to maintain, and obviously we have to think about the workload on the RSE staff as well. So as it's all getting big, we wanted a consistent way to manage this. And Adrian had already been using Agile and Scrum in the mobile development service, and he wanted to roll it out to the rest of the RSE department. Okay, so we're going to be talking about, we're going to be, as I've said, firing some questions back to you. So the first question, which will be on the next slide, is all about project management in your group. Then I'm going to give an Agile and Scrum overview. Then we're going to a couple of quick questions about Scrum in your group, and then Adrian's going to talk about adaptation for the University of Manchester RSE department, so how we've changed requirements capture tools and the modifications we've made. And then we've got some metrics and measures around sort of GitHub and the use of GitHub, because that's what we use. And then we'll want to ask you some questions at the end about whether you'd adopt Scrum. Okay, so first of all is our first question, so I'll just leave that up for a bit. So if you could go to that link, it's menti.com, so MENTI.com. Just leave that up there for a bit, and then okay, so what methods of project management do you currently use? So I can see there, so Agile-ish, that's good, you'll enjoy this talk. So GitHub projects, which is also something that we use in ours. Rapid application development. So Agile's coming in a fair bit there. We've got Kanban, Agile, and Scrum seem to be the main ones, and GitHub projects. I like that, winging it as well, so we all know about that. Okay. Okay, so I'm now going to give an Agile and Scrum overview. So apologies to anyone who already knows all about Agile and Scrum, but we made this presentation for people who didn't necessarily know about it and wanted to find out more about it and whether it fits with the RSE model. Okay, so Agile methodologies. So it's a methodology for project and product management built on a set of values. All of our managers have been sent on the Scrum course now, so we've been learning about all of the Agile and Scrum values and things like that. So the Agile Manifesto defines the values: customer collaboration over contract negotiation, responding to change over following a plan, and individuals and interactions over processes and tools, and working software over comprehensive documentation. So if you notice, it says over, not instead of. So they're not saying forget contract negotiation or following plans. It's just saying that those take the priority. And what we find is from using Agile and Scrum, it really opens up communication with the group, with your project group, and it's kind of like a really important fail quickly mentality. So you're showing everything as you're going along, you're agreeing what you do, and if it's not going in the right direction, it's really easy to change it. So there's many implementations of the Agile Manifesto and its values. So Scrum is the most popular and the one most people have heard of. And there's also other ones. Another popular one is extreme programming. Okay. Yeah. No problem.
Oh, are we okay now? I think we're okay. Okay, if we're okay.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. Okay, so there's lots of project management techniques. So the obvious one in IT is a fairly well-known one is the waterfall process. So this and a lot of other typical project management techniques, it's very linear. So you start with the requirements at the beginning of the project. You do the planning and design, implementation. So the requirements engineer works out what the requirements are. They do the planning and design early on. The implementation is all done. It could take months, it could take years, and they do the testing, and then the feedback from the stakeholders comes right at the end, where the stakeholders get to test it. So the problem with that is, especially, like, I think more and more as we go forward, technology is changing and things are changing. We've had things like COVID. So things just change all the time. Unexpected changes come. You don't know how things are going to get affected. So you get a lot of projects where the original requirements are no longer valid by the end of the project. So that's one of the main things that Agile tries to overcome. So in the case of Scrum, which I'll explain now, so the process is executed once for the entire project. So in the case of Scrum, what they do is it becomes a cyclical, so it becomes iterations of sprints. So we do the requirements capture, and so we have the product owner now, who was the requirements engineer. We do the requirements capture, do planning and design, implementation, testing and feedback as lots of cycles, and each cycle is called a sprint. So the feedback is constant, and if we start going down the wrong path and implementing something wrong, it's really easy to correct because it just comes back. Or if the requirements change, obviously, as I've just been saying, it's really easy to change the requirements. Okay, so a project is carried out over many sprints executed back to back. Yeah, so as one sprint ends, the next one starts, and it's a constant cycle. Okay, so the main Scrum roles, there's a Scrum team and then there's a Scrum role. So we're going to do all of the Scrum roles first, and then we'll tell you which one of those are in the Scrum team. So the stakeholders have a vested interest in the product. They're not part of the Scrum team. There are a variety of non-Scrum roles, for example, researchers and end users, and they're the ones who perform the user acceptance testing. The product owner defines and prioritises the work to be done, so they ensure the work aligns with stakeholder needs and represents stakeholders and the team. So they're kind of like the mediator between the stakeholders and the development team and Scrum Master. The development team are typically 2 to 9 people in size in a typical Scrum team. They're cross-functional domain they have cross-functional domain expertise, which means they can join in on anything that's part of the project. They're self-organising, and they determine together the best way to complete the work. So it's very sort of right on, bottom-up organisation rather than coming down from the top. The Scrum Master ensures that the team follows the Scrum process so that they are in charge of removing any blockers that the development team have, promote exchange of information, and they just generally facilitate the process and make sure it's working properly, and chair a lot of the meetings, as we'll see. Okay, so just to remind you again, the Scrum team itself doesn't include the stakeholders. It's the product owner, the development team, and the Scrum Master. Okay, so some of the actual Scrum objects I'll talk you through now. Well, I'll talk you through the 2 main ones. So the product backlog. So the product backlog is a prioritised list of all the work to be done to deliver the complete product. It's owned by the product owner, but everyone can see it. Like everything in Scrum, all of the artifacts and the meetings, everyone gets to see what's going on. So what are the work items? So examples are new features, enhancements, bug fixes. They can be written in as user stories, which some of you may have heard of. And a good issue has a clear definition of done. So the criteria it has to meet to pass to be defined as done. It's a living thing, so items can at any time be added, removed, reordered or evolved by the product owner. And as I said, the product owner, it represents the stakeholder needs, so it's all about what the stakeholders are asking the product owner for, and that the product owner makes sure that that list is up to date and deletes any items that don't need to be on there anymore and adds new ones and keeps it live. The sprint backlog is kind of like a subset of the product backlog. It's owned by the development team, it's managed by the development team. So it's items to be worked on in the next sprint as agreed by the development team. It's managed, as I said, by the development team, so nobody else can add items to sprints, and that includes the product owner. The product backlog work items can be broken down into smaller items, then moved to the sprint backlog. So when I said it's kind of a subset of the product backlog, it may have more items in it that weren't in the product, where we've broken down the task into smaller tasks that are manageable by the development team. Each work item has a size estimate, which we call story points, which we won't go into now, representing the relative amount of effort to achieve the definition of done. And then the sprint backlog, so that's basically what goes typically into a Kanban board and then gets worked on during the sprint. So how do we get from a product backlog, which was the first list I mentioned, and the sprint backlog, which is owned by the development team? So we have something called a sprint planning session. So I'll talk through now about some of the meetings in Scrum. So the biggest one is the sprint planning. So the Scrum Master chairs it, and they ensure that the process is followed. They get agreed start and end dates. The product owner shares the highest priority items fed down from the stakeholders and defines the sprint goal. The developers break down work items into smaller items and assigns the story points. There's various ways that they can do that. There's like sort of games that you can use to help with that. And they populate the next sprint backlog. And they collectively commit to doing the work. Okay, so you might have heard of a daily stand-up. That's becoming quite, even if you don't do Scrum, that's becoming quite a well-used word now. So in typical Scrum, these are chaired by the Scrum Master. They're attended by all Scrum team members who are present, who are in work. There's strict timing, so they're 15 to 20 minutes in total, so it just gives each person 2 to 3 minutes to talk. Each Scrum team member usually, like, it doesn't have to be like this, but a typical way of doing it is to talk about what you did the day before, what you plan to do today, and any issues blocking progress. And the Scrum Master records blockers and removes blockers after the meeting, so we don't start getting stuck into the details during this meeting because they're timed. In the sprint review, this is so it's chaired by the product owner. It's attended by the Scrum team and the stakeholders, and the developers present demos showcasing the achievements of the sprint. So it may be demos of actual working code, or if it's early, it just might be mock-up demos or a presentation of what is intended if it's early on in the project. And it's opportunity for questions to be raised from the demo. Does the product meet the requirements? And the product owner captures all the feedback, so that they can feed that back then into, so they capture the feedback from the stakeholders, and then he keeps pruning this product backlog to make sure it's up to date. The sprint retrospective is chaired by the Scrum Master, and it gives the Scrum team the time to reflect on the latest sprint, what went well, what needs improving, the assessment of the process, and it's an assessment of the process, not of the individuals. It's attended by the Scrum team, and it's a way of adapting the work to make sure everyone's happy with how it's working, it's working well. Okay, so a couple of questions now for you. So if you want to join in with part 2, and as you probably already have that now, I'll just flip straight over to the Menti. So have you had any training, formal or informal, in whatever project management methodology you use in your group? Okay, interesting. Okay, so it looks like not much difference, but people are generally getting a little bit more training than those that don't. So, okay, and the next question: have you used Scrum or similar in any context before? Okay, so quite a few people have used Scrum in some context. And as we say, Scrum or Scrum similar, because we're going to be talking all about how we kind of use a Scrum-like method. So it can be something that's like Scrum as well. Okay, and then have you used Scrum or similar on any RSE projects to date? Okay, very good. Okay, so quite a few people have. It's interesting to know. There is a Birds of a Feather session tomorrow, I think it is, for project management, and I'll be doing a few of these slides at that, and we'll be talking about project management with RSEs, so probably meet quite a few people there. Okay, I think that's over to you, so that's the rest of... Oh, there is a part two. Oh, sorry, is this what I'm doing now? Yeah. Okay, so if you've used Scrum or similar on an RSE project, how did you find it? Best thing I've ever done. A couple of people saying that already. No one said it was rubbish yet. There we go.
That was you, Phil, wasn't it?
Okay, thank you for that. I think we have to move on a bit with the next. Okay. So if I just Alt-Tab. Okay.
Okay, thanks, Anne. So Anna's given you essentially this is the official definition of Scrum, and if you do anything else, you are not doing Scrum type approach, which you may hear that if you do any formal Scrum training. So naturally, we decided to offend the purists and adopt and adapt Scrum for the use in a research software engineering context. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about how we went about that process. So first of all, why did we adopt Scrum in any of its guises? Why did we choose to do this? Well, this largely comes down to the nature of RSE projects and the nature of research. So you very rarely know right at the beginning of a research project what you want the final output to be. You might have a rough idea of the context, but you certainly don't have a concrete idea of an asset you want to build. And so the requirements are evolving all the time, as are the priorities of those requirements. So you need a process to manage the project which is happy to deal with that kind of environment. We've talked about failing fast and having regular feedback, because you don't want to invest time and effort building something that turns out to be the wrong thing. So as the requirements are changing, you want to be able to make contact with your customer to whom you're working, who you're delivering to make sure that you're adapting appropriately. You often get cross-functional teams in research where you're not all software engineers. You might have data scientists, you've got PDRAs, you've got PhD students all working collectively, and the sort of non-hierarchical nature of Scrum teams means that this also lends itself nicely to that approach. And obviously these projects can be extremely complex. So the concept of breaking down complicated tasks into a greater number of smaller, more tractable tasks do make the overall solution more viable. So again, it's something that works really nicely. Scrum also sets out a set of clear roles and expectations, so people know clearly what is expected of them. They know what hats they're wearing and what they need to do in those situations, so there's less uncertainty there. If you're using tooling, like in our case we use GitHub, to track the issues, then it basically means anybody working on a task has a way to diary and catalog exactly what they're working on, and that's visible to all of the people in the team. So it's great for visibility, it's great for having some auditable trail of what work you've been involved in. And of course it eliminates that bus factor. So even if you're the only RSE working on it, if you work and use the tools and keep track of what you're doing, then even if you happen to be, move on to a different team or move on to a different project, anybody taking over after you will know exactly what's happened. There's no need for complicated handover documents and the like. Why did we adapt it? So again, we weren't frightened to offend the purists. We decided that if you look at the left-hand column, this is essentially what the sort of by the letter Scrum says you have to do. So developers largely work on one project. You consistently have all the roles filled. You have dedicated people who are product owners, dedicated people who are Scrum Masters, etc. And what you're building invariably is a thing. You're trying to build a software solution or an asset or something. But if you look at the right-hand side, this is actually the common experience for a lot of research software engineering projects. Okay, RSEs are generally split across multiple projects. You have an unpredictable team makeup, so you can't say for every project we're going to fill all those roles and these are the people that are going to do it. That just does not work. Academics themselves can't always be product owners. Some of them just aren't really that interested. Some of them are just so busy they don't have time to product own every single thing that they're involved in, especially if they have a very large group. So you've got to be flexible to work out how you fulfill that responsibility in your team. We often have our senior RSEs act as in kind of Scrum Master capacity, but again, they're often split across multiple projects and wouldn't be able to police every single one that they're doing to the same level, so we have to be flexible again. And finally, we don't always build a thing. So people can engage RSEs to support a lab. It could be some ad hoc work to help upskill PhD students. It could be training. It could be just dealing with day-to-day issues that they have to get things done. So we're not always building a piece of software. So we have to be aware of that as well. So what we did is we kept in all the things that we felt actually added value. No matter how you choose to implement it, all of these things we felt added value. So we might not do it as per the letter, but we do have a product owner role, we do have a Scrum Master role, we do have a development team. We have our product backlog, which we store all our issues and tasks on. We have a sprint backlog, which we plan each iteration over a flexible period of time. We do use Kanban. We do have a sprint planning meeting of sorts, and that varies in its implementation, and that does happen every single sprint. We do have stand-ups, but not daily. Okay? Anybody who was doing the maths earlier said if we had 70 projects on the go at Manchester, and we've got 50 RSEs, and we decide to spend 15 minutes doing a daily stand-up for every single project, then the entire week is just spent in stand-ups. So obviously that was not a no-go to begin with. We do sprint reviews, so we do, at the end of every sprint, show what we've been working on, demo what we've been working on, and make sure that we're on the right track. And the sprint retrospectives happens via one-to-one relationships between the RSEs working on a project and the senior RSE who's providing oversight to those projects. So ultimately, the message here is that we kept all the core elements, but how we implemented those core elements is what we varied. Ooh. Right, so this is probably the key slide that I'm not going to talk through, but I really hope that people spend the time to look at this a bit later, because essentially the two main variables we have are the size of the project, so whether you've got one RSE working on it or you've got 5, 6, 7 RSEs working on it, and how engaged are the researchers, the stakeholders. So do you have an academic that wants to get into the nitty-gritty, actually wants to manage the issues themselves, or is it a question of the academic is far too busy to focus on every single project, they just want a PhD student or a PDRA to act as a kind of advocate for them in that space. So we've got a low stakeholder engagement and a high stakeholder engagement, and then a small project and a large project. So what you'll notice here is that this just describes from real projects that we're actually doing right now, how we chose to implement the Scrum Light framework that we're running with in each of those instances. And this may well resonate with you in all kinds of levels in the projects that you're operating in. Okay, so a little bit about tooling. We chose to use GitHub Projects. It's not necessarily the most mature solution because it hasn't been around that long, but it is getting better and they're adding functionality all the time. So this is as opposed to something like Jira, which has been around a long time. It's a very mature solution for managing Scrum projects. There were several reasons why we chose this. I think ultimately this is free. So this is free for academic use, which is great. Where we'd have to pay for our Jira licenses. It's perfectly adequate for what we want to do with custom fields and things you can add to projects. You can represent the information that you need to in order to do sprint planning, in order to track and measure the things that you need. And obviously, a GitHub project board lives side by side with the code, which is the vast majority of the code we write lives in GitHub anyway. Not everything, but most things do. And of course, we can just give user accounts to our researchers who can engage then directly with the issues. They can comment and they can communicate with us on those issues directly. Okay, so measures and metrics. So what we decided to do is we actually really only introduced this this year. So early this year, we sort of did a rollout where we said, right, every project is going to be managed like this. And we wanted to see how effective that's been. Now, the caveat here is, of course, we've only been doing this for 4 months, so we probably only have about 4 months of anything we can measure here. So we've got a combination of qualitative feedback, metrics, and quantitative. So the qualitative ones is we've simply just asked our senior RSEs who are owning the projects, what do you think what do you think impacts do you think this has had? Now, these are long quotes, and I won't read them all out, but just to pick out some of the key points, I think it was recognized here that it helped to manage a process, get people involved, helped engagement. The next one here is they felt it made things more efficient. Okay. This one was about transparency, visibility, focus. The concept of time boxing was very, very helpful to be able to break those long projects into small units that we can evaluate at each time. That it fosters communication. And just to try out a bit of a balanced view here, somebody did comment that we did get some pushback from some of the RSEs as developers, not necessarily the senior people, but the more junior people, perhaps who are less familiar with the process anyway, as to why we were doing this, why was this needed, because they felt from their personal experience that a level of oversight and management like this felt like it might have been an overhead. So it was also a good opportunity, because we did it collectively via a training day, that it gave us an opportunity to justify why this was worthwhile. So what did the RSEs themselves think who were developing on the project? Well, they recognized that it can be applied flexibly and should be applied flexibly. I think it's important here for projects of different scales. It was an invaluable technique to help clarify the requirements. It navigated ambiguity and set realistic expectations, and this essentially managing stakeholder expectations about what we physically can do over the next 4 weeks. It provided a common language for communication, and we weren't completely derailed by surprise change in requirements. I like that quote, because I think that most of us, that would resonate with us, where requirements have changed from one day to the next, and we don't want a system where that would completely derail what we were doing. And finally, the idea of integrating it with GitHub, which is independent. That was a choice of what tooling we would use. You may choose to use something different if you want to go down this route, but it really helped us to have that alongside the projects on which we were working. So what about the academics that we worked with? What about our customers, if you will? Well, getting feedback on this was quite difficult, as you might expect, and it did seem to be a largely one-sided. So most people thought it was excellent that we asked. They said that it made concluding every sprint feel like a great achievement, and I think that's really important, actually, culturally, for working in research where it can feel like a bit of a slog at times. Great transparency of the issue tracking, so the academics knew what we were working on, when we planned on doing it, and what we'd achieved so far. And one particularly engaged academic said they loved the ability for them to dynamically adjust priorities, help me feel closer to the project development. So they were definitely ones that got into the nuts and bolts, set priorities and labels on issues, and really helped steer what they would like us to work on. And that's rare, but it's great when they can do that. So in summary, for the feedback, yes, it helps with complexity. It makes things easier, makes things slicker, more consistent. We benefit from visibility, we benefit from control, but I do caveat that with, I think there's probably a silent, indifferent, potentially majority, because we just didn't get the volume of feedback we would like from our customer base. You know, if you're hearing 3 or 4 comments from 70 projects, then what do the rest think? So maybe take it with a bit of a pinch of salt. But then we wanted to know, really, how has our behavior changed as RSEs? How has that changed over the last sort of 4 or 5 months? So we did try to get some usage metrics from GitHub. So this is all of the RSEs in the group. So if you imagine first quarter, we introduced the training. The overall commits seems to have fallen. No explanation for that at the moment, but I'll say a bit more about it later. But ultimately, the number of issues created has absolutely massively increased. So the use of GitHub for tracking your work, recording your work, and recording tasks as issues on GitHub has hugely increased as a habit. The number of pull requests people have raised has also increased as well, which is nice. So the approaches we're taking to do things in smaller bite-sized chunks means we're merging smaller changes more often rather than large changes less often. And we tried to do a split by where is the behavior coming from? Is it the senior people in the group or is it the more junior people? And I think ultimately you can sort of see from this graph that compared with the previous one, the vast majority is coming from the senior level, which is sort of unsurprising, sort of leading by example, I hope. But you're also all seeing the same sort of behavior at the junior levels as well as they follow that lead. So I think ultimately from a conclusion perspective on this one, there's little to no impact on commits, which I think is probably expected because the Scrum process says nothing about what your Git habit should be. Okay, it's not about how you use Git. So I think that I would expect to see a little change in how people are committing. But it has increased, obviously, the issues created in PRs created, and I think that's a testament to recording the work that we're working on, breaking it down into smaller chunks, merging things little and often. But I do think it's far too early at the moment to assess any long-term trend. We've only been doing this for a few months, so we will redo this again next year and see if that is indeed sustained. Okay, so we're going on to our part 3 Menti now, so this is the final part to this. Right, here we go. So, if you could resume here then. So I'm extremely confident that RSEs on my team would engage with Scrum or a similar Agile process. So if you were to introduce this tomorrow, if you haven't already done it, do you think it would work? I'm extremely confident that academics on my research projects would engage with Scrum or similar Agile process. Good, that's probably more positive than I was expecting actually, so very good. I am definitely going to consider or suggest using Scrum-like Agile methods for RSE projects. And I suppose for people who already do it, I suppose you can vote certainly, since you've already won that battle. Okay. Good. I think that's the end of the Menti. So we will look to share those results, I think, and make sure we make those widely available. That would be very useful. Right, so just in conclusion, because we're reaching the end of our time here. So, so the key points of the overall talk is we really wanted to make sure that we had a consistent yet flexible approach. So that is the reason for just delivering any kind of change to how you do project management for RSE projects. Ad hoc is fine when you're small, when your projects don't vary potentially that much and you've got lots of resource to spare. When you're stretched and when it's large, you need to have some element of control. And zero management is not an option, I think, when you get to a certain size, including management by exception. So Agile methodologies embrace continuous change, and whatever approach that you choose needs to be dynamic and not obstruct that process. And of course, the best way you can achieve a positive outcome from changing a process like this is just make doing it easy for people. Don't make it seem like an overhead. Don't make it hard. So choose a process that's suitable, choose a tooling that is easy and familiar, and you will get some positive results from it. And as I said earlier, don't be afraid to offend the purists. Okay? Adapt it to suit your needs, because otherwise there's little value in doing anything else. Okay, and there's a few links to some Scrum resources that we used to inform the work that we did. Right, thank you.
Thanks.
So thanks for the wonderful presentation and Adrian. So I have a question. So although Agile is in academic way is a very systematic process, but in terms of like IT industry, when it is implemented, a lot of things are ignored. as because the focus of the IT industry is to just to deliver the product rather than following the process. So what is your point of view for this gap thing? What do you think about it?
So in an academic context, the question is, what do we think about ignoring various aspects, or in an industry context?
Like a lot of sprints and scrums are ignored, but in academic literatures and academic articles, it's a very systematic. But in terms of practical and implementation, there is always a gap between the industry and academic things. So why is that, and what are your point of view?
Well, I believe it's a tool, and like a lot of tools, you use them to to what works for you best and what works for the team best. So I think it's important to have the theory there, but then I think it's good to adapt things. So when I first came off the Scrum course, I was like, but we don't do that and we don't do this, and we've got RSEs that are working on several projects, that's not allowed. Yeah. But then you just think, well, it does work. Like there's certain things that we need that Scrum and Agile can give us, but we can never do Scrum perfectly. So I think you just adapt the tools to fit your needs.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think the important thing to remember is in academia, things are probably far more uncertain than they are in an industry context, and we don't operate in the same space. We're not delivering the same things. We're not operating in the same way. So why would we try to mimic it exactly? I think what we need is something that's flexible, that does work. And if you're dropping things out, then you probably don't need them. Right?
Thank you so much. So now questions from Canopy. Can you please read?
Would you discuss why you decided to perform the retro one-to-one rather than as a Scrum team? So the retro, it's because we have such small teams. So we have the RSE lead who acts as the Scrum master, and then we usually only have one or two RSEs, often one on projects, as they're smaller projects. So it's just a matter of the size of the team, really, getting the feedback for that project. So there might be more there if it's a larger project, but there tend to be one or two people, one or two RSEs.
So I would probably cite that slide way back here that I didn't have a chance to go into too much detail, but we don't actually neglect the retros as a team on all projects. Okay, it's a question of it is an overhead. And you've got to kind of decide how you cut your cloth. So I think when you get to quite large projects and you've possibly got high involvement, then you will consider doing the full Scrum process. So you would do a retro as a team. If you get to a stage where the project's only small or your sprints are quite long, then sometimes it's not necessary. You're getting the feedback through other mechanisms. I think if we were detecting that people were not being engaged in an appropriate way, we can adapt that and do retros in a different way. Okay, so the bottom one I think came in first, which is how have you adapted GitHub products to suit you? Have you created custom fields for effort, priority, and the metrics? Yes, we have. So we created custom fields for priorities. We've created custom fields for sort of story point estimates and other things that are sometimes project specific. It just depends on how you want to treat your work items on that particular project, and that's another element of flexibility. It doesn't have to be a by the manual, these are the things, the metrics that you measure. That also can be quite project specific. So we have indeed done that. A particular case where you found Scrum to be not optimal. So I mean, I've got a thought. By all means, chip in. I think I'm gonna risk saying no, but only because I'm interpreting the question as not where we found Scrum, official Scrum, to be non-optimal, but actually, have you found a situation where you weren't able to adapt Scrum so it worked optimally? I think if I interpret it like that, I've yet to find a scenario where we can't adjust Scrum to fit the project type whilst keeping all the core elements that we stated earlier in the slide. Did you have anything else?
I guess there's one project that I used to work on where, they stopped using Scrum eventually because it just wasn't supported enough by the team, I suppose. Like, it does have to have some support from the academics and the whoever's acting as the product owners. So I think it can't just be the RSEs that are pushing it. It's got to be a little bit, you know, they've got to agree to do it. So
I think that's definitely true if you have a large team.
yeah,
You've got to get a wider engagement.
that was a large project.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that might be it for... Oh, one more. Have we got time for one more? So how do you engage the less tech-savvy researchers in your projects working with GitHub issues, project planning, which happens on a more technical scale?
So the main interaction that we get with the PIs or PDRAs is in the sprint planning meetings. So we just open up the GitHub board and sort of explain it to them, and what, you know, we write things for them in the task cards, and it's quite, I mean, everybody sort of gets used to learning using it a little bit at least, but find it quite easy to explain. And yeah, is there anything to add to that?
No, I'll take the lights dimming as it's chucking
yeah. All right, so
yeah, absolutely. So a lot, just to close that point, I think quite often you'll get people who are not tech savvy, not familiar with GitHub, not willing to engage with GitHub, but that doesn't stop us doing it. So we essentially, if they want to send us requirements over email, then we'll take the requirements and just translate them onto GitHub issues. So we're still using the tooling, and largely if we do that whilst they're talking, you save time.
And the tooling is really just task cards with text, you know, written of what they want on it, so they're usually quite happy with that. It's just a slight different way of looking at it and arranging it.
Thank you so much for Anne and Adrian for the wonderful presentation. Huge round of applause.